Welcome to November in Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. In the US, November is when we celebrate Thanksgiving, and so I want to tell you I am thankful for you. I am so thankful for our guests who are joining us this month. We have some wonderful conversations ahead for you. And as it's Remembrance Day and Veterans Day in the US, I do want to express my appreciation for the brave women and men who have fought and continue to fight for our freedoms. Now, enjoy learning all about history and the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics.
Welcome, everyone. I am thrilled to have you back with Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. And this is a really exciting episode for me today because we're joined by someone that I have been wanting to speak with for so long, an author I really admire. Not only does she pick such fascinating subjects, but she writes about them in the most beautiful ways. It's just a real treat to read her book, and it's wonderful to have her here. So we are joined by Leah Redmond Chang. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you for such a wonderful complimentary introduction. That's really, I'm just so pleased to hear that you've been enjoying what I'm writing.
Oh, yes. So I'm going to hold up and you can hold up too. The book will sort of be zooming in on mine. As you know, sometimes I can't wait. It takes a while to get the books from Britain, right? So I'm like, no, get them on my Kindle right now. It says available now. And so I do. But anyway, we were talking about this beautiful book, Young Queens, Three Renaissance Women and the Price of Power. Now, that is a title that just begs to be read. So before we jump totally in, I want to ask you, what is it that drew you to this period of time in England and France? Because you talk about things not in an isolated way, but in a very large way. But what drew you to this period?
Well, what drew me to the period? Wow, that is a really good question. I mean, I think like so many people, it's sort of an early childhood thing, somewhere along the line you get introduced to Anne Boleyn. There's no going back, right?
Right. She seems
Although,
to be the gateway drug. Anne Boleyn is the
she's the
gateway drug.
Right. And it would be so interesting to kind of interview a number of people and find out like what is it about that story, right? Is it
Mhm.
because, it feels like on some level you can you feel that some sort of injustice has been done, or is it, this idea of scandal? And I'm sure that the answers are different depending on the person. But I, I think that's what first drew me to the period from the very beginning. I mean, that's how I kind of knew I was, angling for somewhere in the 16th century. But to be honest, I started out my career as a history of the book person. Um, I was not particularly into Queens, and we can talk more about that later. I was really into the materiality of the period, the fact that this is, when print culture really comes into being. I just fell in love with the material book, and to some degree, I actually think well, a couple of things. Once I started to get more interested in 16th century France in general, you cannot avoid Catherine de Medici, who's one of my queens, right? If you're studying 16th century France. And,
Mhm.
she is just so fascinating. So, I got more interested in her. But at the same time, I think that my interest in material culture, my interest in history of the book also really informed my interest in women because I was looking at their letters, like the material letters. And I really felt that I was learning so much about these women by by looking at the actual material object. Um, I felt like the material object was telling me more about them than anything I had really read, certainly in the secondary literature. So all of this is a very long way of explaining how I landed on a subject that basically draws on, both very much the lives of queens, kind of wants to explore what it was like to be a young queen in the Renaissance, while at the same time really drawing a lot of material from the actual correspondence, because that was the window, into what they're thinking and feeling. And, I think for anyone who's interested in women's history, that the material is very thin, right? It's full of holes. So you go where you can to try to find the women.
I think that's great. And I love the idea of the letters themselves, not necessarily the transcripts of the letters, but the letters themselves. And I remember the first time, this is just outside of your group, but she's in the background, Elisabeth I. And when she wrote that, what they call the tide letter to her sister, and you can read the text of that letter, and that's really interesting. But when I saw how she scored the rest of the page and how carefully she had done that, that tells you something so important about that young woman in that moment, trying to take matters into her own hands and preserving her story in that moment by eliminating the chance for somebody else to write over it.
I think those letters, and I love that letter. I know which letter you're talking about. I love that letter. There's an immediacy to it. It really puts you in that moment, and you get a sense of the feelings that surrounded the production of that letter. And what really astounds me about that letter, and I would love to hear, your thoughts about it too, is the presence of mind that she must have had, to score that letter, to make sure that the information was safe and couldn't be tampered with. If I had been in her situation at that age, I like, I don't know what would have happened. I don't think I would have scored the letter. So it really says something about her. Yeah.
It does, because she knew she was on her way to the tower, and she timed it with the tide to miss one tide, but it's not like she didn't go the next day. So that's where she was headed, the place her mother had died. And yet, to give herself the best chance at telling her story, she took that rest of the page when she was finished writing what she had to write and made it impossible for someone else to add to it. That kind of thing, the materiality of that, like you're saying, does take you into the moment of these women's lives. And so that comes through in the pieces we have from the three women you are looking at as well, because we do have some of their letters and some of the pieces of a book they have written in and which page and all those kinds of things. So I want to read a bit of a review, just a little snippet from one of the reviews, calling your book a delightful historical study of women coming to the forefront in a world dominated by men. So I just think that's such an interesting way to think about the time, because there are women coming to the forefront during this period of time. So why is it that the 16th century seems to be a time where we have more women than previously in these kinds of more public positions?
Okay, well, so there's a lot to unpack in that question, and even in that little snippet of a review. Um, yes, there are more women coming to the forefront, which doesn't mean that women haven't always been powerful in many ways behind the scenes, right? In some ways, I think that there's kind of a hidden power. I'm not convinced it was hidden in the 16th century, but it might be hidden to us, as historians looking backwards. So there's this sort of more private or secret power, or sort of understated or unrecognized power that women exert in the 16th century. But it's true that there are more women coming into positions of visible power in the 16th century. Some of it is coincidence, and perhaps, for instance, poor family planning choices on Henry VIII's part, that just ends up, leading to Mary Tudor on the throne and then Elizabeth Tudor on the throne. And awkward things like deaths, of kings for the second, for instance, Henry II of France, right? When his sons are just old enough to take the throne themselves. I'm thinking the oldest son, who was 15, that's Francis II, but not old enough to really be an effective leader. So, his mother on some level has to come in as an unofficial advisor. And then, on top of it, I guess, another coincidence, it's all related in some way, but it does seem to be a kind of series of coincidences that, France, for instance, in the 16th century is really in the middle of this religious upheaval where no one really knows, no one really knows where it's all headed. And there are different factions, fighting for dominance. And that's really a moment when there's such severe infighting, particularly within the nobility, right? The sort of leadership class, of the 16th century, that creates a space where more women can come to the fore, because women had long been seen as sort of these appeasers, right? And the diplomats. That was sort of their very gendered function. Women are natural peacekeepers. That's not always true. That was certainly the view. And so there's more of a space for women to do their traditional role, but to now do it publicly. So I think that's why we're kind of seeing more of it, even if it was always happening behind the scenes. But if I could say one more thing about that particular line, that these women sort of exercise power in a world dominated by men, I would say that even though there seem to be more women coming into positions of power as queens, sovereign queens, or regents, or what have you, in some sort of governing position, it's still a world dominated. It's still a patriarchal world, where there are views of women that definitely cast them as inferior beings. And a lot of the women who are in positions of authority, they're just constantly running up against that.
Yes. And so just because we're seeing them now, maybe it's more visible, it doesn't come. And you mentioned without a cost, right? There is a price of exercising that power. And part of that is the assumptions and the laws and the religious traditions that continue to pull women back or downplay their capabilities.
As well as their primary role, reproductive role, which is why I think personally that, reading about queens now, queens from the past now, is almost more relevant than ever, because obviously we're having, quite a large national discussion about women's value as it relates to their reproductive role. And, one of the reasons why I was attracted to queens was because I feel like they offer such a wonderful case study of the way that gender works, and the way that gender works in that the relationship between gender and power. You kind of see through the examples of queens, the ways in which, or how, the world has conceptualized the value of women.
That's really true. And so even these sovereign queens, and we see Mary Queen of Scots, for example, as a sovereign queen. She is the Queen of Scotland. She is the monarch. And yet, because of her gender, she is treated very differently than her father or her son. So it's very interesting, the assumptions about power related to her. So you're right. It continues to be something that they are grappling with and have to navigate all the time. So
especially when they're young. Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
excuse me,
no.
but especially when they're young, because those are also their years of fertility, right? So they're still being very much defined that way. And that is still their number one goal, is to produce a child, for the dynasty.
Yes. Produce a child for the dynasty. It's not like for yourself or for enjoyment or for love, for the dynasty. And that's extra pressure when you are a queen. So please introduce us to the three women who are the young queens in your book. And let's talk about how they, in different ways, face those expectations and roadblocks and challenges throughout their lives in these really fascinating ways.
Okay, so my three queens are Catherine de' Medici, who is the queen consort of France and eventually becomes the queen regent of France. She's also the queen mother of France. She occupies a lot of roles. Her daughter, Elisabeth of Valois, who becomes the queen consort of Spain. And finally, Mary Queen of Scots, who's Catherine's daughter-in-law, who is the Queen Regnant of Scotland, and she's also the Queen Consort of France. And eventually she becomes the Queen Mother of Scotland too. So she also is, one of these women who wears, multiple crowns, but she also carries multiple titles and has multiple functions, multiple ways of being queen throughout her life. So, I've already introduced them. Clearly they're related. They're all related, whether it's through marriage or through birth. And one of the reasons why I wanted to work on them is because they actually know each other quite well, and they lived together in the court of France for many, many years. But then they separate. So Catherine stays in France. Elizabeth goes as a teenager to Spain. And Mary Queen of Scots, she's in France for a little while, but eventually she has to go back to Scotland when she's 18 to reign Scotland. And they go to these different kingdoms where they have to kind of deal with a whole bunch of different challenges. But one thing that really struck me is the way in which many of the challenges seem to be the same, even though they live in different countries, which again, I think really speaks to the question of how much being a woman, defines what these challenges are. And being a queen, how much that defines what these challenges are, no matter what kingdom you're living in. Where should we go next?
Well, let's talk about Catherine, because often when we think of Catherine de' Medici, we think of her as a powerful person, which she became. But her path to that was very difficult. And it helped me understand her better as Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort of France, to know what she'd gone through. So tell us a little bit about that.
For sure. I do think, we always have a tendency to kind of look backwards at history, right? Instead of looking forwards. And, it was a challenge, but I really wanted to kind of look forwards, sort of where were these women at any given time and what did they expect, versus what happened to them. So it's true, Catherine comes to France as the wife of the second son. She's not even the wife to the heir to the throne. She's the wife to the second son. And that marriage is made as kind of a deal between the King of France and the Pope. It's really kind of, it's mercenary, like so many dynastic marriages are. And I really think, Catherine comes to France hoping for a much better life than what she had as a young girl in Florence, because she is the last in the line, in the senior line of the Medici, who have been ruling Florence for quite some time, but with a lot of ups and downs. The Medici have a lot of enemies. And as a young girl, she really finds herself, caught between the Medici and their enemies in Florence. And for several years, she's actually a political prisoner. She's sort of a hostage to a group of Republican governors of Florence who managed to seize control of Florence when there was a power vacuum. She doesn't really have any protectors at that time. Both of her parents have died, but a sort of, a theme that she must have picked up on even as a young girl is that if there were going to be any protectors in her life, it was probably the French. And that is because Catherine de' Medici was actually the daughter of a French woman. Her dad is a Medici, but her mother is a French princess. And that is something that we often forget about with Catherine de' Medici, because, well, we think of her as a Medici. Mm-hmm. Later in her life, she's associated with Italians. We think of her in sort of this, almost apocryphal sort of way as bringing all this Italian culture to the court of France. In many ways, she seems to kind of embody Italianness in France. But in some ways, I think that Catherine was actually raised to think of herself as part of the French nobility, because this was definitely cultural capital, at least as far as the Medici were concerned. And they were really hoping for a high-level marriage for her. And indeed, that's what they got. She marries into the French royal family, and that is probably the highest-ranking marriage that the Medici have ever achieved, right? So it's really something. But she's still only married to the second son. And so I imagine, that she thought she was going to spend the rest of her life having babies for the second son, and that was it, But that's not what happens, because the heir to the throne of France dies as in his late teenage years, and Catherine and her husband, who was Henry, are then poised to be the future king and queen of France. And that was really quite a stressful situation for the young Catherine, because at the time that this happens, Catherine still hadn't had a child. She had been married for several years. She hadn't really shown any signs of conceiving. And for several years after her husband becomes the heir to the throne, she still doesn't conceive. And this is like an age-old problem, right? For women in Catherine's position. Like, will you or will you not have the baby? And this is what it's all about. Like, if you do not have that baby, you are worthless, completely worthless, because the dynasty has to go on. Not only does the dynasty have to go on, if Catherine doesn't have a child, then her husband, the future king, looks weak before he can even take the throne. And there are always people around the throne who are kind of looking for their chance, right? So poor Catherine, as a teenage, girl, and then this young woman, is really under a lot of pressure to have a child. And finally, after 10 years of marriage, she does. And luckily for her, it's a boy. If it had been a girl, that would have been okay, but really not so great. But it's a boy. So we don't know what happened exactly. Why she suddenly has this child. It does seem like the problem probably lay with Henry. And I have a sneaking suspicion too that this young couple wasn't, really trying hard enough. Once they started trying in earnest, things really fixed itself. And so then Catherine goes on to have 10 children, which again, because a queen's value or a future queen's value is really wrapped up in her reproductive prowess, this is a lot of, capital that she has built up by having all these children. And Catherine will continue to use that capital for the rest of her life. She has several boys, and over the course of the rest of her life, and she lived for quite a long time in that period, until she's 69. She will often refer to all the princes that she gave birth to, all the children. She's reminding people that, look, I've done my duty. I deserve a political voice because I've done my duty. But that was really a challenge. Her barrenness was really a challenge that I think, kind of left this. Um, I think it was very traumatic for her, and that trauma stayed with her. I'm not sure she really ever totally got over it. And that is why she actually becomes a very involved mother in her children's lives. But in some ways, this was a good thing because when her husband dies at the age of 40, and he dies in a really traumatic accident. He's in a joust. There's a freak accident. He gets a splinter in his head. It infects the brain. They thought he was going to recover, but he didn't recover. 10 days later, he dies. Um, you know, what is left of his legacy is Catherine and these very young children. The heir to the throne is 15, but Catherine is able to establish herself as a really important advisor, in part because she has done her reproductive duty as queen and because she has actually built up quite a nice relationship with her children. So they trust her, and it makes sense to them that she is going to stand by their side and help lead them.
Well, and it's so interesting because her power really is solidified as she keeps having, especially the sons. Not that the daughters aren't important, but those sons. And interestingly, her first son, and then her next son, and then her next son, she has 3 sons who take the throne. And that's quite remarkable, right? I mean, that's not the typical thing. Her sons don't grow up and have sons. It passes to their brothers.
It's yes. So it's both like remarkable, but also kind of a failure at the same time, right? Like that's not what's supposed to happen. On the one hand, you want a lot of spares just in case, because life is so fragile at the time. But you hope that one of those sons has a son, who can then become the heir. And that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
They keep dying before they can do this. So yeah, again, I would love, I would just love to be in Catherine's head to know what she was thinking, because there must have been just so much tension between, there must have been so many moments of her feeling like a failure, even as she has to step up to the plate and just hold things together for the Kingdom of France so it can move forward.
Right. Over and over again. She spends
over
so
and
many
over
years.
again.
She spends so many years doing that. So then she has these 2 younger women in her life and others, but she has a daughter-in-law, Mary Queen of Scots, and then she has her daughter, Elisabeth. So let's talk about, since Mary Queen of Scots becomes Queen Consort of France first, let's talk about her and her time with Catherine, her relationship with Catherine.
Yes, and she's also older than Elisabeth, right? So, to some degree, as a person, Catherine probably gets to know her better first, before she gets to know her own daughter, because Elisabeth is only 2 years old when Mary shows up on the scene in France. So the reason why Mary comes to France is because, yes, she's the reigning Queen of Scotland from the time she's a baby. But Scotland is in the throes of war with England, and it's really become kind of a religious war. England, for years, generations, has been trying to annex Scotland, basically, like absorb it into the English crown. And Mary's mother, who is Mary of Guise, doesn't want this to happen. So Mary of Guise isn't Scottish. She's a Guise. She's French, sort of. She's from Lorraine, okay? But we're just going to call her French because that makes it easier. So she marries James V, and her only surviving child is Mary, Queen of Scots. That is why Mary takes the throne. She did have older brothers, but they died as babies. So Mary of Guise is very interested, first of all, in making sure that the crown of Scotland stays with her daughter Mary. And she also really has no interest in having Mary, you know, be somehow officially united with any kind of reformed kingdom. So by this time, Henry VIII had pulled away from the Catholic Church, and then his son Edward is even more fanatically reformist than his father had been. So Mary of Guise, who is a very devout Catholic, just doesn't like this at all. So she strikes a deal with the French that what's going to happen is she's going to send the young Mary, who's aged 5, to France for protection. And in exchange, there's kind of this loose contract that Mary will eventually marry the Dauphin, who is the heir to the French throne. This is quite a nice little prize for France, because they are assuming that what's going to happen is that Mary, one way or another, is going to hand the crown of Scotland over to France. And since we're in an age where every male monarch is very interested in building his empire, this is, quite a little jewel to add to the French jewel box. So that's how Mary gets to France. And she comes, in some ways, pretty Scottish, to the extent that we can call it that. There was a lot of French influence at the Scottish court at the time, but Mary is really raised by Scottish nursemaids, Scottish governesses. Comes to France, and Henry II, the King of France, decides that what he really wants is for Mary to completely attach herself to France, really think of herself as one of them, and stop thinking of herself so much as a Scotswoman and think of herself more as a French woman. And Mary's French family, the Guises, are perfectly happy to go along with this, because as far as they're concerned, France is the superior kingdom, first of all, and secondly, they are interested in their own careers in France. So from the get-go, they are using Mary to kind of bolster their own status in France. So they have no problem with Mary thinking of herself as a French woman. So this is what happens. Mary, from the get-go, is given a French education. And one of the first things that happens is she is assigned a bedroom with the young French princess, Elisabeth of Valois. Elisabeth is 2 and Mary is 5. And that is the beginning of their relationship. And it really is kind of an older sister, younger sister sort of relationship. But to all evidence, they were close. But I would say that they were probably close in the way that sometimes, older, younger sisters are close, which means that sometimes there's a little tension in there.
Yes.
I think there was definitely a little tension. And Mary was kind of bossy. But, from what I've seen in the correspondence, it does seem like Mary and Catherine were quite close for a while. Mary was really a radiant child. She really impressed all the adults around her, including Catherine. And Catherine was pretty good at hiding her true feelings most of the time. But there is something that feels quite authentic to me when she writes about Mary Queen of Scots, at least Mary Queen of Scots as a young girl. Things would start to change when Mary gets older. But for a long time, Catherine had every reason to be close to Mary Queen of Scots, because Mary was slated to marry, it's always hard to say, but Mary was slated to marry Catherine's son, Francis. So Catherine is thinking of her as a daughter-in-law who she hopes to be close to. And you can kind of feel the orphan Catherine looking forward to having this familial relationship, with this radiant young girl. She even says at one point in a letter that, she could see in the young Mary Queen of Scots the solace of her old age, that she imagined that she was going to get old and Mary was going to be there, at her side. But it didn't work out that way. Mary became more of a thorn in her side, I think. Um, but so, I would say that, Mary being raised as a French woman on some level is at the heart of her troubles later, in Scotland, when she had to deal with very nationalistic and very Protestant Scots lords who really distrust her, not only as a woman, but as a kind of proxy, for French Catholic interests. So, it's one of those moments where you can kind of see why they thought this was a good idea to raise her as a French woman. I mean, it would have made perfect sense to most people, but ultimately ends up being kind of a tragic mistake. And you do wonder if she had been a boy, if it would have gone the same way. And I really don't think it would have, because if she had been a boy, she would have been raised from the get-go to think of herself as the sovereign king of Scotland. He would have been raised to think of himself as the sovereign king of Scotland. But Mary was really raised to think of herself first as a consort, the wife to the king. And so, she never really effectively starts thinking of herself differently, more as a sovereign than as a consort.
And that's really interesting because she seems to have really embraced the notion of being queen consort of France. She was all in. She seems to have loved Francis very much and the family, and to have loved France. I mean, she really seems to have thought of herself as they had hoped, as French.
Yes, and I think she actually was a fabulous queen consort. I think that she
Yes.
would have been, if Francis had lived more than the 18 months that he lived once he took the throne, who knows? Because she was really good at it. She knew exactly how to behave as a queen consort. She knew how to take the spotlight in a certain way. She was charming, she was witty, she knew how to be politic in a certain way, in a very, feminine way. And you can kind of see her when she's back in Scotland, desperately trying to find a way to get back into that role, because she knows that's where she's the strongest.
Yes. And she's been
Mhm.
successful
Yes.
doing that. And really, even before she goes back to Scotland, she seems to be casting about for another place to be queen consort of, rather than hurrying back to Scotland to be the sovereign queen. She seems like she would almost prefer to be queen consort somewhere else, whether in France with the younger brother of her, former
Charles,
husband.
yes,
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 yes. Um,
yeah.
so that seems to be what she really wants, but that does not happen. So, do you think, and this is from my research, I feel like she would have been very happy if someone had said, "Well, why don't you marry Charles now and stay in France and continue?" Why did that not? I mean, I know there's an age difference, but that doesn't always represent a block to that. Why did that not happen? She'd been so good at it. Why did she
Yeah.
not
So,
just stay?
so this is where, yeah, okay. So my subtitle is Three Renaissance Women and the Price of Power. And, one of the things I was really interested in is how these women, on the one hand, seem like they could or should be so powerful. And on the other hand, why they're so powerless because they are women and because they're young women, right? So your question ties into that theme. It is because, you know, once a girl becomes of marriageable age, um, she starts to mean something different in the political theater, right? Like her value is different. And that is what happened to Mary. The problem is, by the time that, Francis, her first husband, dies, France is on the brink of religious war, a civil war that has completely divided the nobility. And Catherine was, by this time, is she's the queen regent for her young son, who is 10 when he takes the throne. she is really worried about what such a civil war would mean. I mean, it really did look like France was going to implode, on some level. And by this time, Catherine has become extremely suspicious of Mary's French family, the Guises, because the Guises are becoming increasingly strident in their Catholicism. And I kind of just want to like put a little nuance on that because if anyone knows this period at all, they usually think of the Guises as these sort of like arch conservative Catholics, and that especially comes out of the later generations of the Guises who are more active in like the 70s and the 80s. But it wasn't really clear at the beginning, when their family first starts to rise in France, that that's the way it was going to go. The original Duke of Guise was really considered like kind of like a stellar figure, at the court of France, very honorable guy. Antoinette de Bourbon, his wife, she was a Catholic, but she had a lot of she had a real network among family members and other clients who were Protestant. She didn't necessarily, at the beginning, seem like she was going to be the sort of diehard Catholic in the way that the Catholics became. But over the course of the late 50s and into the late 1560s, the Guises do seem to be taking a harder and harder line. And they have also been incredibly influential in the reign of Francis II, Catherine's son, who dies. Mary Queen of Scots is a first husband. And Catherine really thinks that they manipulated him and that in some ways they've made the situation worse. And she also thinks that they're mostly out for their own profit, for their own gain, their own power. So she's really nervous about whether or not they're going to be able to exercise influence over her son, her second son, who takes the throne, because he's only 10 years old. So, Catherine is trying to keep the Guises on the side to the extent that she can. She is really trying to, curtail their power. So that is why ultimately she decides that there is no way there's going to be any kind of marriage negotiations going forward between Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, and her son Charles, because that would put the Guises right back in the council room at the helm the way they had been before. And this is sort of the more personal tragedy. It's clear that Catherine doesn't trust Mary herself. Yeah, the young girl who seemed like she was going to be the solace of Catherine's old age, it now seems to be totally devoted to the Guises, much more than she is to sort of, the affairs of France. And that's partially because Mary was so young. I mean, she's a teenager. You can kind of see it. But there's just no way that Catherine was going to take any chances that somehow, that loyalty could be used against her son or against, to further sort of a radical Catholic agenda in France.
Yes, as Catherine is trying to keep things together and prevent a collapse.
Absolutely.
So how does the story of her daughter Elisabeth and a marriage with a pretty Catholic king, Philip, how does that play into Catherine's view of keeping France strong and at the same time taking care of Elisabeth, her daughter, and finding what turns out to be a very advantageous marriage for Elisabeth? But Philip's tricky, so how does that work?
I think that's the understatement of the Philip's tricky.
Philip's tricky.
He's tricky.
All kinds of things, yeah.
Yeah,
Tricky
no,
to say
Philip
the
is
least.
tricky. But I will say, in writing this book, Philip is someone who I kind of knew the least and who I really enjoyed getting to know, in some ways in writing this book. Okay, so first of all, we probably should establish that Catherine is Catholic. I don't want to
Yes,
give the
yes.
wrong idea that that she is somehow Protestant. No, she is Catholic. The extent of her deep piety, the way the Guises are, it still remains up for debate. But she's definitely Catholic. But she's thinking in very political ways, and as you say,
Yes.
she just doesn't want France to explode. She wants to keep it as intact as possible for the benefit of her sons who are inheriting the crown. So Elizabeth comes into the story because she's the oldest daughter of Catherine and her son Henry. And her marriage was actually contracted when she was 12, though she doesn't get married until she's 13. Her marriage is contracted to end what are called the Italian Wars. So France and Spain had been at war for generations. Again, as part of empire building, they were fighting for territories in Italy. Spain wanted them, France wanted them. They had different claims in different ways. And so off and on, there were these battles, and that's what's known as the Italian Wars. And actually, that is why Catherine de' Medici first marries into the French, royal family. It's a deal that's made to try to, bolster France's advantage in the Italian Wars. Okay, so basically, the daughter is inheriting the mother's story
Yes.
in many ways. So Elizabeth's marriage is contracted and she gets married in 1559 to Philip II, who has recently been widowed. He had been married to Mary Tudor, for those who know English history, but he's a free agent. And he and Henry II, they were tired of these wars. Their treasuries were depleted, just a lot of blood had been spilled, and it was time to patch things up. Also, because both of them are dealing with this rise in Protestantism, or the threat of the rise in Protestantism, and they're eager to crack down on that. So they're turning their attention to domestic affairs. It is at the wedding of Elizabeth to Philip that Henry II is killed. It was part of the celebrations, the joust. There's almost something Shakespearean about that, I feel
Yes.
like. You know what I mean? Like, it's just very, it's just made for tragedy. But that's what happens. But the wedding goes forward anyways. There was some doubt that maybe it wouldn't now that Henry had just suddenly died. But the wedding goes forward. But from that moment on, Catherine is really anxious for that marriage to succeed for completely political reasons, because she can see that Protestantism is a growing threat in France. She knows that Philip doesn't like this at all. He is a very ardent, very pious Catholic. He's very worried that any kind of Protestantism in France is going to spill over the border and take hold in Spain and threaten his own kingdom. And she is worried that, and she was very right to be worried, that he was going to take the side of the Guises and find a pretty good reason to wage war on France again. And she had every reason to believe this, because for generations, Spain had been the enemy, and suddenly they decide to, make peace and sign a treaty, and then suddenly they're the ally. But the deep feeling in both countries is that these are still enemies. So it would just be very easy for war to kind of flare again. But if that were the case, Catherine and her young son would be dealing with both an international war against, the very strong, powerful armies of Spain, and an internal conflict with Protestants. And, that would have been just a complete disaster. So Catherine is looking to her daughter, Elizabeth, to hold that marriage together. because she sees Elizabeth, and frankly, everybody else sees Elizabeth as the peacemaker. And in fact, that becomes Elizabeth's nickname from the time of her wedding. She's known as the Queen of Peace. So she kind of marks the peace treaty, but then Catherine, really takes that to heart. She's going to have to be the person who helps, keep the peace. But what Catherine is also hoping is that while Elizabeth is keeping the peace, hopefully she's doing so by, subtly working for France's interests. And, again, I feel like this is really kind of a window into what was expected of so many noble and royal women at the time, is that they were always seen as kind of the connection between powerful families, and they were always seen as kind of negotiators or, liaisons between these families. And while they were supposed to, become part of their husband's family, they were also supposed to kind of advocate for the family of their birth. That is what Catherine expects of Elizabeth. It's just that now it's rising to an incredibly, national level of, sort of untold consequences if she fails.
And she is so young, Elizabeth. I mean, she's not like a tried and true. She's had years of experience. Philip has years of experience and years of commitment. Elizabeth comes over and is so young. And I think that's easy to forget because she's put in this position, and it's a very tough, would be tough for anybody. But I just think especially as young as she was, I mean, you said she 12 and then 13, and then she's supposed to be the peacemaker.
Yeah. Oh, totally. She's 14. I think by the time she gets to Spain, she just had her 14th birthday, because it takes a long time for her to get to Spain. But she's still playing. She's still playing with toys. When she gets there are letters, talking about this. So she still is a little girl. She's not fully grown. They're and everyone knows this. And I guess that, the good news for Catherine is that the Spanish aren't really willing. They don't really want to jump back into war quickly either. Everyone is willing to give Elizabeth just a little bit more time to grow up, and everyone wants this to succeed. And thank goodness, right? Because otherwise I just don't even know how she possibly could have done it. But, so in the meantime, to your point, given how young she is, Catherine kind of has to assemble a team to help Elizabeth succeed as Queen Consort of Spain, during her first few years. And, the key players in that team are some select ladies in waiting, some of whom were very close to Catherine, and Catherine really, trusted them. She invested them with, a lot of kind of oversight of Elizabeth. And the other one is the French ambassador in Spain. And he was, he filed a lot of letters away in his files and kept them. And thank goodness, because that is how we have access to some stuff that no doubt would have been lost, because it wasn't necessarily seen as important. It was correspondence between ladies in waiting, or ladies in waiting and Catherine about female issues,
Yes.
So I'm sure these things would have been just tossed aside, but we had this ambassador who decided that they were important and kept them. And that's how we kind of see how Elizabeth grows up in the court of Spain and becomes her mother's agent, but not without some tension there, right? Because again, just like sisters, mothers and daughters sometimes don't get along.
Yes. Well, and there's pressure too for her to be her husband's agent, right? So
absolutely,
her husband and her mother, don't always want the same thing. So,
Well, and I just want to make a statement right now too about another conversation that we're having currently in today's society about young girls. and just, how they're raised to think, how they move through the world, what it's like to be a young girl. And, by studying and writing about Elizabeth, you start to realize how much serious politics had to do with how well a teenage girl was performing her role, both as, in Elizabeth's case, just like Catherine, whether or not she could actually conceive and bear a child, but also even politically. I mean, Catherine really expected her 14, 15, 16-year-old daughter to intervene with Philip about French political affairs. And, Catherine, I mean, it goes to show Catherine's desperation, actually, that, she decided that her daughter was just going to have to do this. But, this is a young teenage girl whose mistakes might have considerable consequences in what happens, and whose successes might have considerable consequences. So when we think that this conversation, or this question of teenage girls, turns out to be a very, very old one. And it turns out that teenage girls have been far more important politically than maybe has been recognized.
Well, yes, I think that's really true. And their capabilities and their insight and their ways of seeing their own lives. And you mentioned something else that I want to make sure we attend to, which are the team that Catherine puts together. Again, these women, ladies in waiting, who are playing such an important role, but this is not a visible way that we see women leading sometimes. And yet these women are, with Catherine and Elizabeth and going between and sharing, they are playing a really important role. And so that's another kind of that almost invisible female leadership that we were talking about earlier. In addition to the visible leadership we see, there is a lot of less visible leadership going on.
Sort of whisper networky, kind of back channel diplomacy that was extremely real. And, the thing is, I want to say the men understood how important it was too.
Yeah.
You really see that in the French ambassador. His name is the Bishop of Limoges. He understood the game that was being played here. And also understood Elizabeth's important role. And so, yes, the sort of chief matron in waiting, is coaching her, but so is the ambassador. Yeah. And Catherine will often write letters saying, do exactly what the ambassador tells you to do. Like, don't stray. Like, this is her way of, So what's really incredible is that all of these understandings, in terms of the roles that all these people were supposed to play, are being communicated and understood through correspondence.
Yeah,
correspondence that is taking weeks to arrive. Yeah. Right. It's not like you pick up the phone or you have a secret Zoom meeting or anything that's so immediate. It's taking weeks to arrive, and in the meantime, everyone has to play the game as best they can, knowing what the rules have been up to this point, not knowing if in 2-3 weeks' time the rules are going to change.
Right.
So, it's a completely different mindset. But sorry, getting back to the ladies in waiting, absolutely. And this probably leads to the point that is the most important thing about Elizabeth, is that one of the most important roles that the chief lady in waiting played was to take care of Elizabeth physically, to make sure that Elizabeth stayed healthy and that Elizabeth had every opportunity to conceive, and to give birth to a child, because, that was going to seal her position in the Spanish court. Until she did that, she was vulnerable, and she couldn't be that influential necessarily. So, that is a source of anxiety for Catherine, because just like Catherine, Elizabeth proves to have some trouble with conceiving, again, trouble that lasts for several years. But here's what Elizabeth does in the meantime. And this, I feel like, is an even quieter success that I think Catherine communicated one way or another, but that is not given any recognition, is that Elizabeth gets Philip to fall in love with her, or at
Oh,
least
okay.
to like her enough that that he becomes attached to her. You know, Elizabeth is always, she's always described as gentle. I have a feeling this is someone who is quite likable, you know, in many ways. But she manages to do something, and you know, I want to believe it was actually intentional. And the reason why I think it was is because Catherine was telling her, do what you have to please your husband. That she manages to succeed in that way. And it's often seen as a product of her nature, you know, that she was just naturally this wonderful, gentle spirit. And so he falls in love with her. But was it? Or did she know how to deploy that nature
Yeah.
to political effect?
Well, right. And certainly she had an opportunity with her mother to learn how to do those things for political effect, whatever it is, to use whatever you have, use the cards you've been dealt to get the outcome you want. And if part of that is your
Yeah.
pleasing nature, yeah, use that.
And you know, that these are seen as tools that can be politically deployable. And you're completely right. I mean, I think that's Catherine's genius. First of all, she kind of has this natural grit and scrappiness,
Yes.
which I really
Yes.
admire. But, you know, we're talking about a woman who turned motherhood into a political
Yeah.
and, you know, into the fabric of political branding,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, so the thing that should have in some ways kept her out of politics is the thing that brings her into politics.
Yes.
But she did that. She created the
Yeah.
narrative, right? That
Yes.
allowed for that to happen. So I
Yes.
think you see a little bit of that starting to happen with Elizabeth as well. I mean, in that way, yes, I think she's her mother's daughter.
Yes. And that's where, and we sort of see with Mary Queen of Scots, it goes a different way because her motherhood, because she's had a son, when the lords turn fully against her with Bothwell after Darnley's murder and all of that, they prefer the baby boy to the grown-up woman because they can take James into their care and then run the country, right? So, in a way, Mary's motherhood ultimately does work against her, whereas Catherine has made it work for her. It's just a really interesting way of thinking about that.
You know, what is the line from Barbie? It's almost impossible to be a woman. It's like it's
Yeah.
almost impossible to be a queen. Certainly, if you're Mary Queen of
Yes.
Scots. I mean,
Yes.
she does the thing that you were supposed to do as queen. She gives birth to a boy, and in her
Right.
letters right after that moment, you can feel her relief. You can. She thinks she has it wrapped up. You know, she did
Yeah.
the thing. She had the boy. Now everyone's going to leave her alone and you know respect her,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's what she didn't have. And things are going to settle down. And if anything, it's the thing that allows her to be displaced. But you know, the other tragedy, the thing that Elizabeth has that Mary didn't have, is that Elizabeth has her mother,
Yes.
and Mary didn't have her mother
No.
because Mary of Guise died
Yeah.
before you know, Mary Queen of Scots gets back to France. And Catherine has no interest in helping
No.
Mary succeed as a monarch. And I wonder, you know, if Mary of Guise had still been alive during, you know, Mary's early queenship, you know, you know, when she really took the helm in Scotland, would things have gone differently?
Yeah.
Because Mary of Guise was a very savvy and keen
Yes.
politician.
She was.
Yes, much more so than her daughter. And we have to remember that Mary was only 18 years old when she gets back to Scotland, and she hasn't been trained to be a sovereign queen. And that was Mary of Guise's fault. Mary of Guise should have found a way to make that happen.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, so she's really alone out there,
She is.
Yeah. Yeah. She's really alone out there. And, kind of realizing that and realizing how young she was made me just so much more sympathetic to
Yes.
her
Yes.
than I had
Right.
been.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. So as we come to the end, and I hate to say that because I could go on talking to you forever, but out of respect for your time, as we come to the end of our conversation, we have these three amazing women who have had a different background. I mean, certainly if you look at Catherine de Medici's childhood versus the childhood her daughter had, and Mary Queen of Scots, I mean, they come from this different background. They come together. They do have this time together in France. And then as they split up, and as you say, Elisabeth of Valois does still have the support of her mother, whereas Mary Queen of Scots is very much on her own. And yet, Mary Queen of Scots, as she is ultimately sent to her death, reclaims her own narrative too, through all kinds of ways as dying as a martyr. I mean, I really think she makes her death count for what she wants it to in amazing ways as well. So I think each of these women in her own way has sort of the last word. So what would you say that you want us to take away from this, the way these women are together and what you have done in discovering and writing about and sharing their stories?
Well, I guess what I would say is, first of all, in terms of, sort of method or angle, I really wanted to write a history from the point of view of the women, including sort of taking account of the things that would have been important to them and what would have been the personal tragedies and what their relationships were with each other. What were the challenges that they shared? What was in what way could they not empathize with each other because they're still in this system, that favors again a sort of patriarchal way of looking at the world, and pits women against each other, for political reasons. I'm not always convinced by these arguments that women at this time were supporting each other.
Right.
I don't necessarily see that. But it doesn't mean that their challenges weren't shared and that those particular challenges have everything to do with being young. Certainly, I mean, I spent a lot of time talking about what it was like for Catherine as a young woman, and then I talk about Elizabeth and Mary when they're young, but being young and female. So, I I think that sort of personal angle, a very gendered female angle is something that I would want people to kind of keep in mind as they, go into it and as they come out of it. And then, I'm always left asking sort of what has changed and what has stayed the same between then and now, Again, I think I said earlier that for me, one of the benefits of looking at queens is to kind of understand how the relationship between gender and power works on a kind of fundamental level. And I still think that we're seeing that being borne out today.
Yes, that is a question we have not answered because it is still an uphill battle for a woman to embrace power and not be described as bossy or bitchy or whatever it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And also that so much of how women are conceptualized, their role in society does have something to do with reproduction. It has to do with their bodies.
Yes. Yes. And the ability of bearing children and whether or not you have born children and all of that. Yes. So fascinating because we're still grappling with that in so many ways. And I think that's one of the fabulous things about history, about books like this, because it does require that we keep thinking and keep talking about these stories about women in the past, about women today, and the shared challenges and strategies and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is the value too of revisiting old stories. You know, we think we know, but lots of times when we go back, we realize, wait, there's this whole other dimension here that I hadn't really been, aware of before. And maybe it's worth thinking about a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's great. And that's what you do. And you said you deliberately tried to take us to the beginning without looking back through the end that we already know, but from the beginning and experiencing it that way. And so just thank you. Thank you for this brilliant book and for coming on and sharing with us this wonderful discussion about these women and our time and the connection that's so important and powerful regarding queenship and power and the price of all of that and all that we're continuing to need to talk about. So thank you so much, Leah. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. This was really enjoyable for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. We appreciate your being part of this. Now, if we want to hear more about you and what you're doing, where can we find out?
So probably a good place to start is my website, which is my name, leahredmondchang.com. But I also publish a monthly newsletter. It's called The Only Woman in the Room. It's on Substack. You can get to it from my website. And, I have to tell you, like one thing that I am thinking about a lot whenever I hear about something contemporary that's going on with women, I often flash back to, some sort of historical episode that reminds me. And so in that newsletter, I try to do the work of putting those ideas together, the past and the present. But I also, that's where you'll find, information too about, what I'm doing now and eventually what I'll be working on next.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'll put all those links in the show notes, but thank you so much for telling us about it. And we'll just all go find out more. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And everyone, if you don't have this yet, please go get this wonderful book. And I'll hold up mine again if you've got yours right there.
I'll hold up mine. Yeah, I think mine's backwards in the camera.
Oh, that's all right. Here we go. All right. No, I think it's right forwards. To me. There we go. Okay.
Yours is good.
Okay.
So we get both views.
It's on Kindle, but it's good. Okay. And I'll have all that in there. But thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. We are trying to expand our reach a little bit and share the joy of listening to history. So please take a minute to give us a rating, maybe share with a friend. We really appreciate it. And join us again soon to see how history shows us what's possible. Thank you.